Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Perpetual Chess. We have a psychology professor and scientist who I'm excited to welcome to the show in a minute. Just wanted to give a shout out to our sponsors, Chessable.com. So continuing on the theme of our recent interview with Grandmaster Helson, Chessable is making up more fictional openings. Now, friend of the pod, Lawrence Trent, has made a course about something called the Baltic defense. I didn't know that was a thing either, just like I didn't know the Austrian defense was a thing when Grandmaster Jan Gustafsson, Lawrence's old co-commentator, made that course. But apparently the Baltic defense is 1d4, d5, 2c4, and then bishop f5. So to the extent that it exists, that's what it's about, and you can get that coming soon. It may not be out yet when this comes out. We will see. It is coming in August. And also Grandmaster Alvaro Alonso Rosell has a 100 repertoire on the Benko. I know the Benko is always popular for club players, so be sure to check that out. And if you sign up for Chessable Pro, be sure to use the link in the description, and you will be able to unlock additional features. Also, be sure to check out our other partner sites at perpetualchesspod.com/partners, like Chess Dojo, Chess Mood. They have rolling special offers that change from time to time if you want to try out those sites. So you should do that. And without further ado, so our guest is a psychology professor at North Dakota State University. He received his SB, which apparently is MIT speak for Bachelor of Science.
Same thing. We just,
He learned his SB at MIT and his PhD, which they didn't change the letter order on, also at MIT. His research focuses on visual recognition, specifically the development of face and texture recognition in middle childhood. He's published over 100 journal articles during his research. But most importantly, he's gotten into chess. So he actually played scholastic chess competitively as a kid in the Pittsburgh area, but regained interest in 2022 around the pandemic time. Does that story sound familiar? He's primarily an online player, but also an active blogger as, quote, NDPatzer on LiChess. That's capital N, capital D, Patzer. He also posts the same articles as well as a few more on his Substack. Those of you who are subscribed to my free Substack newsletter might note that I link to nearly everything our guest writes because his posts are fascinating, relating to the intersection of chess and science, touching on topics ranging from whether stronger players move their eyes less than weaker players when competing, whether pattern recognition is an overestimated skill among elite players as compared to the ability to solve problems, and whether there is momentum or streakiness in an individual's chess play. And there's lots more than that, but without further ado, let's welcome to the program Dr. Benjamin Balas. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
Yeah, excited to chat. As you know, longtime fan of your writing. I can only understand about 80% of it most of the time, but nonetheless, I've learned a lot from it. And we have a lot to dig into, Ben, but I thought, and I'll be referring to an interview that Ben did with friend of the pod, Dr. John Kabadai, on the Chess Cognition podcast about 8 months back. So I'll be referring to that a few times and definitely recommend listeners check that out as well. That one is Dr. John has his stuff together. So he's actually posting video on Spotify, I noticed. I usually watch on YouTube. But anyway, so that one has some slides. We're going to be primarily audio here, but listeners should definitely check that out. And one thing I wanted to follow up on, so you mentioned to John that you got back into chess during the pandemic, but I didn't catch the story behind it. What dragged you back in specifically, Ben?
Honestly, there's not a great story here. I'm guessing it is familiar to most of your podcast listeners. I was home all the time, right? I mean, I was sitting around without a whole lot to do. And my father-in-law has been interested in chess for a while and kept saying, like, oh, we should find some time to play. And it occurred to me, like, I just kind of didn't know what was going on with online chess anymore, right? Like, I didn't sort of know what platforms there were, what was out there, because I hadn't thought about it in a very long time. And that led me to chess.com and LiChess. And I thought, you know what, let's set up some accounts and see if I still remember how this game works at all. And in the sudden copious free time I had, I kind of went down the rabbit hole again and decided to spend some time actually learning and improving.
Nice. Yeah, such a familiar tale. And when you did come back in and discovered this overwhelming array of resources and videos online, what struck you? Was there a particular content creator that grabbed you or something that surprised you about the way chess was being presented? 30 years later.
Yeah. One of the first things I wrote about in one of my very first blog posts, I think, was about different time controls. Because as a scholastic player back in the late 80s, we played regular tournament games pretty much all the time and a small amount of blitz. But the very existence of bullet was kind of a shock and really overwhelming at first. My first bullet games were characterized by a lot of just blank staring at the monitor because the idea of playing a full game in that kind of time control just seemed like utter madness. It still might be, right?
Right.
But yeah, that was a big shock. It was really exciting to find out just how many content creators there were doing videos about openings and just history of the game. So one of my entry points was Levi Rosman and Gotham Chess. He was one of the first people I found who was doing some good instructional videos, and I sort of branched out from there.
Okay. And of course, your research by day related to science and psychology. At what point did did you start to think about writing about the intersection of chess and these topics?
Yeah, I guess that took me a couple months of getting back to playing to start thinking about. In part because being a scientist now, playing the game almost immediately, I felt like I was running into these topics that were relevant to the way I think about stuff happening in my laboratory. And I kind of had these vague recollections that there were papers about chess I had studied as a student. And again, I sort of wondered, well, what's current about this stuff, right? Are people still doing this work? Do people know much about these connections between the pattern recognition piece from a vision science perspective and how we think about it in chess? What are people doing in terms of learning and memory research as applied to chess? And so I started just kind of browsing around for those articles and thinking, you know what, one of the best ways to understand them is to try and explain them to somebody, so that I felt like I knew what was going on. Writing about them so other people could take them in felt like a good way to make sure I really digested the main ideas.
Excellent. Yeah. And for listeners, I asked Ben later on to share the 3, it might be more or less than 3, we'll see, but the scientific studies that he feels are the most important for chess players to learn about. We'll be talking about that later. But I actually, Ben, in terms of the stuff you've written about recently, I wanted to start with your most recent post, which is about, as I mentioned at the top, sort of this idea of momentum or streakiness in chess. Now, you told a story in that post about your own chess. What experience was it that you shared that led you to think about streakiness in chess?
Yeah, again, I'm guessing your listeners have some familiarity with this phenomenon, but we were traveling a couple weeks ago, and you have a lot of downtime often while you're traveling. So I opened up the laptop, logged in, started playing some games, and I had this stretch where it just felt like I couldn't lose, and the rating is going up, and you start feeling good. Right? You're seeing stuff over the board. You're setting traps your opponent's falling into. And I think like a lot of folks, when that kind of streak happens, you have this moment where you think, maybe I'm better now. Right? Because everyone knows there's always those day-to-day fluctuations in your rating. But when it really starts to feel like it's piling up, you think maybe something's clicked. Maybe there's been some switch flipped and I'm at some next level of chess understanding. And you start to feel good about it, right? And kind of wondering, like, is this the new me? Am I really a player who's at this level instead of where I thought I was? Then, of course, the next day dawns, right? And you start playing some games again, and you start watching the inevitable regression to the mean,
right,
where it turns out that fantasy of being a better player is maybe a little bit over-optimistic. So I had a slump almost immediately after I had this remarkable winning streak. And it just got me thinking a lot about how we perceive that kind of streakiness, how we explain it to ourselves, and what kind of evidence there is for those streaks reflecting real changes in play versus just the inevitable byproducts of randomness.
Yeah. And as you and I chatted about a little bit a few days back as we were getting ready for this interview, I share this fascination as a sports fan because, there's been a lot of research about what they call the hot hand effect in basketball. They research it in particular, whether if you've made 3 shots in a row, are you statistically more likely or less likely or the same to make the 4th one? And anyone who's watched a lot of sports might, there's definitely the perception that people get hot and people get air quotes in the zone. And I, for some reason, for all of my chess and sports fandom, hadn't thought about it as much with chess, but you got me thinking about it. So what do you think, Ben? Is it a thing? Is there non-random streakiness in chess?
I do think so. And in part, I think so because of the results reported in that article I described in my blog. It's one of these things where people get really angry about the hot hand effect in both directions.
Right.
One of the things about it that makes it so much fun to read work on. This paper does one really nice thing to try and examine whether the streakiness they're seeing in this case, it's LiChess Blitz games, whether that's statistically real or not. The nice thing they do is they compare streakiness in a player's real sequence of play, the actual series of wins and losses that a player experienced over time, and a shuffled version of that same list. And so the logic is, if you shuffle up the order of the games and measure the streakiness in that kind of tells you how much to expect hot and cold streaks just based on someone's win rate or something like this. What they're doing is comparing what you see in the real world, in the actual series you played, to that sort of baseline. And that lets them make, I think, some good statements about that streakiness being real and being more than you would expect from just how many wins and losses you happen to have.
Yeah. And again, intuitively, it squares with me. I mean, we've certainly, whether it be in an OTB or just an online setting, there are days where you feel more alert, days where you've gotten better sleep, and that can manifest in results that again, wouldn't necessarily be random. And as you mentioned, a few posts have been written about it recently. FM Nate Solon recently wrote about the role of luck in chess. And I feel like it's tightly intertwined, because Nate pointed out, like, people say, chess is a game of complete information. All the answers are out there to be had in theory, but there's still luck in terms of the variance that your opponent may encounter in a given day in terms of how they slept, whether they got stuck in traffic and arrived late to the game, as well as those same attributes to you. So the luck is more hidden than in a game like poker, but it still exists. And that luck, I think, would manifest in sort of outsized streakiness.
Yeah, one thing too I think is sort of interesting about chess compared to some of these other domains where people study the hot hand is the authors of this paper talk about losing streaks as well as winning streaks. And it's funny, you mentioned this book the other day when we were chatting called The Hot Hand that very much focuses on basketball. I actually grabbed a copy of it because I thought, Ben mentioned this, like, I really should read this a little bit before we talk more. And one thing I thought was funny in there is he doesn't talk about slumps at all.
Huh. Interesting.
He talks so much about people having like hot hand streaks on the court where they're making shots. I think I mentioned this in my blog post. One exercise I gave my students to do years ago was simulating Joe DiMaggio's hitting streak in baseball. Right. But there's also a big interest in the sports literature in slumps, right? Lots of negative outcomes. And in the chess world, of course, we think about being on tilt a lot. Right. And that idea of this mental state where it's almost self-defeating, right? You're missing stuff because you're a little angry, because you're convinced you're doing poorly today. And now those losses kind of pile up.
Yeah. So that book, The Hot Hand, has been on my radar for years. It came out a handful of years ago. It's by Ben Cohen. Mm-hmm. I haven't gotten around to reading it myself yet, but I did hear an interview with him once where one of the anecdotes he shared was amazing. He was talking about like Spotify and Apple Podcasts playlists, and he said that when they have it on the random setting for it to shuffle the songs within your playlist, they would constantly get complaints that it wasn't random, because sometimes you might get like the same song twice in a row and people are like, this is rigged, this isn't actually random. So he said they actually had to adjust the algorithm to seem more random. So they like messed with the distributions because people didn't properly appreciate their randomness sometimes seems less coincidental instead of more.
Yeah, and that's something I'm fascinated with from the cognitive science side. We all have an understanding of what we think it means to be random. Right. And there's tons of work showing we are just really off about that. Like, our understanding of how randomness actually works is not grounded in true randomness.
Yeah. So I guess the moral of the story for chess players is just, I don't know, from my perspective, it's you're going to have bad days. Would you say there's any other sort of implications that the chess players should draw from this topic?
I think it's twofold, and one of them very much echoes what you just said. Like, streaks will happen, both good and bad. And it's probably a little dangerous to read too much into it in terms of worrying that much about whether it means you're getting that much better or that much worse. But the second thing I'd say that I think this paper kind of suggests is some of that streakiness is real. And so if you find yourself losing an awful lot, like, maybe it is time for a little recharge. There is such a thing, it seems at least, as being on tilt. And there is such a thing as having a good day where you are, maybe like you say, just a little more alert, a little more on top of things, keeping in the back of your head that those can reflect something meaningful about just kind of where you are right now. And maybe that's a reason to keep playing if you feel good, or to stop playing if today's not the day it's working. Those are signals to interpret at least a little bit.
Yeah. And in thinking about chess as compared to something like, again, like basketball, like it occurs to me that in chess, when you're tilting, it really kind of takes up a lot of, like, at least seemingly to me, a lot of space in your brain. Your emotions really take over. And I think that might even be bigger than what could occur in a sports domain where so much of what you're doing is muscle memory and physical. I think that my guess is there could be more, especially in something like Blitz or Bullet, there might be more randomness to the downside, or more streakiness to the downside than to the upside. I think.
Yeah, I would love to see them do some of this work with different time controls.
Yeah.
I think that'd be really interesting, because I think a lot of people have that tendency to just click for the next Bullet game in particular.
Right.
And yeah, I would also love to see more exploring that difference between good and bad streakiness, right? The win streak versus the slump. Yeah, they do make some kind of neat statements about cold streaks in particular being a signature of the beginner.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to highlight that. Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, there's much more of a tendency for beginners to go on sort of longer losing tears than for experts.
Yeah. Yeah. And that made sense to me. I mean, first of all, it intuitively makes sense to me that beginners, there might be more variance in their performance, like you're hanging more pieces. So that, that can skew your one big blunder will skew your results more often. But also, as I think to, like, shout out to Omar, who I interviewed, Omar Mills, a few months back. He talked about when he was a beginner, just the full gamut of emotions he would experience with every single game. And I do think that as you become a more experienced player, you stop playing chess, or you like sort of come to grips to that with the emotional toll it can take, and learn to manage it, as Omar has.
Yeah.
A little bit better. But Ben, before we get back to science, I also wanted to ask you, so you've gotten back into chess, and we're very grateful and learn a lot from your writing, but do you take improvement seriously, or are you playing more for enjoyment?
Probably somewhere in the middle. I have aspirations of taking improvement more seriously. I think like a lot of folks. So I've got a shelf of chess books. I try to make time to learn more openings. I've got an endgame book I'm working through right now, because I really feel like I need to shore up my endgame knowledge. It's about finding the time. That's always the hard part. So one of these days, I think it'd be really fun to get a chess coach to keep me a little more accountable at what I try building. It's a question when I'm going to be able to really do that, I think.
Although you're a professor and it's summertime, Ben, it's now or never, right?
Yeah, the problem is summers when you do all that work you were trying to do during the academic year.
Right.
You're never really free, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, what books do you have? Any that you particularly enjoyed, or like which endgame book are you working on?
I am working on 101 Endgames You Must Know.
100 Endgames You Must Know, yeah.
That's the one, yeah. So I'm working through that right now. I've got my Woodpecker Method book that I try and do my cycles of. Those are my big two right now. And of course, I've got my copy of MCO to just practice openings and try and add to my opening knowledge.
And where do you come down on the woodpecker idea of repeating patterns? I know that pattern recognition is something that you've written about. Are you going to actually follow the method, or are you just more using it for the puzzles?
I am trying to follow the method, in part because I have a good colleague who is no longer at NDSU, but who is a learning psychologist. Her name is Dr. Katie Wisman. Her research is all about how people learn effectively in classroom settings and other settings where there's a need for real training. Spaced repetition's real. And that idea of cycles and spacing the sort of time between re-encountering material you've learned, that's real stuff. It really does matter. So that I take pretty seriously.
Yeah, well, the spaced repetition is real. But then there's also, like, as I touch on in my book, the question of whether repeating chess puzzles in particular, does that actually have utility as compared to exposing yourself to more? Like spaced repetition, like obviously Chessable has built a successful business around opening repertoires in particular, because those are very important to know. Canonical checkmate patterns, like in the Checkmate Patterns Manual, even basic endgames, as covered in stuff like the aforementioned 100 Endgames You Must Know. All of these are good for spaced repetition, but Woodpecker Method in particular, like, if it's just some tactic that a world champion played, it's, there's debate. People like Peter Giordano's have said, like, why do I solved it once? Why do I need to remember it? As opposed to like a canonical pattern. What do you think?
I mean, there's this big idea in the scientific chess literature about chunks and patterns and templates. And one of the papers I'll talk about when we discuss like the studies I think it's good for chess players to know about really highlights this idea that by having more chunks, you are kind of expanding your board vision in a very direct way. It's about being able to take in more of the board because you can use long-term memory to identify some arrangement of pieces in a way that means you can kind of consolidate that and have a little less burden on your memory to keep track of what's happening. So I think that part of it probably is a little meaningful, just building up this library of arrangements of chess pieces and understanding what you should do next when you see that arrangement. I think that is still a pretty real and important idea.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Ben talked about this in some detail, and it's quite interesting with Dr. John. So definitely, again, recommend listeners check that out. And just to clarify what he means, like you guys use the example of like a fianchettoed bishop. You know, there's like some pattern recognition force that takes hold where instead of thinking of, okay, there's a pawn on, you know, H2, a pawn on G3, a pawn on F2, and a bishop on G2, and a king on G, an experienced player just pictures that as one thing. And as I think about, I'm always like the thing that amazes me most about strong players, like the trick that amazes me most is blindfold simul's. Like,
yes,
you know, even as a pretty good amateur player, I can wade my way through a blindfold game or two, but the ability to do, 10 games or like 50, like Timur Gureyev has done, just boggles the mind. And I think it must come down to chunking, as you say, which brings us to that topic. So I had asked Ben, I gave him some homework and asked him to come up with a few chess studies that he thought that the chess players who are not as well versed in this topic should know. So you might as well, if you have anything more to say on this one, I feel like we might as well start with chunking since we're already there.
Yeah. One of the papers I was going to mention, this is from Fernand Gobet's group. The lead author is Marin Bilalic. And I love this paper because it's about this phenomenon called the Einstellung effect that is very relevant to this idea of having chunks in your sort of repertoire of how chess games work. And what this effect refers to is basically being tricked by a pattern, seeing a configuration on the board that you think means you have a particular tactic here or some course of action that's a really good idea. But having the actual position be different enough that turns out not to be the right move. So the classic example of this in the paper is something like the Greek gift, right? Like a lot of us know this is often a good idea to do. We should make the sacrifice of the bishop, right? But there's a lot of positions where they can be almost appropriate for that, except for the opponent's piece that compromises the whole thing. And if you're too quick to see the pattern that suggests to you, I could do a Greek gift here, without considering that little bit of variation, you can make what you think is the best move, but is actually a terrible idea right now. I like this paper a lot just because they really do explore at different strength levels how often this happens to players, how often there is this over-reliance on chunks versus really evaluating what's on the board in front of you right now. And they show really nicely, as you might expect, experts do have this problem, but not nearly as often as novice and intermediate players. So experts have a ton of chunks, but they've also got this ability to move beyond just pattern recognition, use that as an entry point, but then really examine the position carefully and see what the consequences will be of doing each line.
Yeah, that makes sense. The concrete over the sort of shortcuts.
Yeah.
They're trained to actually calculate more. Yeah. And actually, regular listeners will know I often recommend the chess steps as a learning manual. And that's one thing that they're noticeably good at is, a lot of learning materials will have a certain pattern and then show it in different permutations, but they do have somewhere that's like the tactic doesn't work, So it's like if you're trying to just blitz through the tactics, it's like you'll go for the same answer, basically, they might switch the colors or something, but you go for the same answer on the next one. And actually it doesn't quite work due to like some hidden pin or something like that. And we should mention Dr. Fernand Gobet, who you mentioned, is also an international master. You and Dr. John talked about him as well as a cognitive scientist. So definitely someone whose research merits following. So that's number one. Are we ready to move on to number two?
Yeah, I think we are. And this one actually kind of builds on this idea of not falling prey to just using your patterns or your chunks and really examining positions. This is a paper, I don't know how much exposure it's received, because from what I could tell, this was an honors thesis by the author that they published as a conference paper a couple years ago. And compared to like a journal article, conference papers don't necessarily get as much exposure. They can, but this one, I'm not sure how many people are sort of aware of it. This is a really nice study where they're looking at confirmation bias in players of different strengths. And if your listeners aren't familiar with this, this refers to cognitive bias where people often look for information that supports the idea they have, rather than looking to falsify the idea they have. So there's a number of ways you can sort of frame problems like this for people. The bottom line is folks are often really bad at working out what the real test of their idea would be, and often just look for things that kind of go along or confirm what they're already thinking, rather than really try and find ways to reject what they're thinking. In this paper, what they were examining is basically how often do players of different strengths really try to come up with the best move for their opponent when they're considering a particular line. And this is really relevant to this phrase I learned when I first started playing chess again, which you may know, hope chess.
Oh, yeah.
Hope chess is all about confirmation bias.
Right,
if you
yeah.
think about a line in terms of, if my opponent happened to do this thing, that would be great for me, right? And it would lead to me winning a piece or me winning the game. But you can't play hope chess. You always have to imagine your opponent did the worst thing for you, right? And was trying to shatter your line, because that is what they're going to do if they're on top of their game. What they did was basically examine the thought processes of players of different strengths to see how often different players really did come up with the best move their opponent could make to really try and reject their idea. And experts do that more than novices. It's almost like a 3-to-1 ratio.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's like much more time strong players are spending really trying to assault their own ideas and disrupt their best idea as much as possible. And weaker players are much more likely to play hope chess and try and imagine sort of the good outcome for themselves.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And someone like Daniel Kahneman, famed psychologist, he always talked about how like a lot of the biases he was pointing out, he was just as prone to as anyone.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, when you play now, Ben, has that like filtered through to your conscious thought process, this idea that you're prone, like the rest of us, to confirmation bias?
Yeah, it really has. And one example that Daniel Kahneman brings up, if I remember right, in some of his writing, is this checklist-based approach to making decisions. One great example of this is if folks are aware of the APGAR test that's used to evaluate newborn babies shortly after they're born, just for their overall health. The APGAR test is a checklist. You know, a delivery nurse looks at a baby and just evaluates their color, their breathing, their alertness on like a 0 to 2 scale. And if the number's too small, time to do something, right? If the number's big enough, everything's okay. Kahneman, if I remember right, endorses checklists like this a lot because we're bad at these different cognitive biases. So, checks, captures, attacks, like make a list for yourself. Remember to look for those things each time. I sometimes have been known to like write that in the corner of a score sheet just to remind myself, like, actually do this. Spend the time looking. Can they check me? Is there something they can take? Can they attack a piece?
Yeah, although be careful when you go to tournaments, because there was a controversy with Wesley So a few years ago where he wrote some reminder to himself at the beginning, like on his score sheet, and he got in trouble for that. It's technically not allowed. Yeah, now, I don't know if anyone would really care if you wrote like, CCA on the corner, especially the Continental Chess Association, especially when
listeners do be careful though, right? But yeah, I mean, whether it's actually written on the thing or it's just like your mantra. Like just remembering after every position, right? CCA, what can actually happen next? I've tried to really force myself to do that as almost a ritual during over-the-board play.
Yeah, and just to clarify, CCA is checks, captures, and attacks, but you'll often hear CCT, checks, captures, and threats. Obviously, they're pretty tightly linked. And before we get back to the scientific studies, I did want to ask you, because I looked up your USCF page. It looked like a lot of tournaments, again, Pittsburgh area as a kid. And then you played 2 in the past 5 years. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess that's right. 2, maybe 3 in Fargo. I think maybe just 2, though.
So how was that experience?
Surprisingly nerve-wracking.
Yeah. It's like, why do I care?
Yes, that's the way to put it. I went in there thinking like, oh, I'm a casual player. This will be fun. We'll see how I do. And God, you sit there across from a real person and you're like, I am sweating bullets.
Yeah.
No, it was fun. I mean, I did find that kind of exhilarating in a way, right? To remember that feeling of competing and hoping you do your best.
Okay. So you think you'll do it again sometime?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Cool. Okay, well, returning to science studies, and any others?
Yeah, there's one more I want to talk about, in part because I am a vision scientist, and this one really intersects with my interests in vision in particular. So this is a paper from Reingold et al., like 2001 or something like this, where they were examining what they called the perceptual span of different chess players. And to give your listeners a sense of what this sort of means, your vision is not the same everywhere in your visual field. So right where you're looking, you get this very high quality, good detailed vision right at the fovea, what we call the center of your visual field. But as soon as you move even just a little bit away from right where you're looking, the world gets blurrier, right? It's much harder to read things that are out to the edges of your vision or to recognize the people around you when you're not looking right at them. And what that means is, even though chess is theoretically this game of perfect information, you're not seeing the whole board all at once.
Right.
Right where you're looking, you can get good information about what's happening, but all that stuff out to the edges of your vision, it's blurrier. It can get jumbled up because of something called visual crowding. That's a feature of the way your visual system works. And all that means is that the information you get is less than perfect. And so you have to move your eyes around the board and combine information from all those different glimpses you get of a position into one understanding of what's happening right now. And the really cool thing about this Reingold paper is they use a really clever way of measuring basically how much of the board players can effectively take in at one time. And the cool result they show is that stronger players have a much bigger perceptual span. They can sort of see more of the board more clearly than weaker players can. Some of that might have to do with chunks. One of the things they show off is that difference in the span changes if you show people mixed up, meaningless chess positions. So you have a big perceptual span if you're an expert for real chess positions, possibly because you're finding ways to summarize what you see using those kind of stored templates that you have. But yeah, I really just love this one because it really highlights that you're not a chess machine. You're a person who's taking a game in through your senses, and those senses have limits.
Yeah.
And one thing I want to say about this, though, I think is super important, and this applies to a lot of this sort of science of chess stuff. I want folks to be a little wary of sort of this one weird trick kind of thing about these things, right? Like the story here is not you should go do some kind of vision training to widen your perceptual span and now you'll be an expert, right?
Right. I started moving my eyes around the board and I gained 500 rating points.
Yeah, right. Don't do that, for crying out loud, please. To me, this is more about just kind of understanding how does your mind and your brain work while you're playing a game of chess. And I like all three of these studies because they highlight real limits on the way your mind and your brain take in and deal with this information. So to me, this is very much about just kind of being aware of what those limits are. And yeah, maybe trying to find ways to countermand them. Use the CCA or CCT mantra to help you mitigate confirmation bias because that's a limitation. Make sure you move your eyes around. Dr. John and I talked about sniper.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that. It's so basic and it made sense to me.
Yeah, but you just need to.
But you would not think about it. Out of all the things to keep track of in a chess game, like now I have to move my eyes around too.
Yeah. But for real, look at the board. You got to look at it because you're going to miss stuff if you don't. That's one of the fascinating things in this paper from Reingold too, or maybe it was another one their group put out. Strong players really don't move their eyes much because they're capable of taking in more of the board at once. But that just means a weaker player should remember to shake your head a few times and look at different squares just to make sure you see stuff. Yeah, to me, all three of these are kind of neat hints at where you run into bottlenecks. Just because of the way your nervous system's put together. And they're things to be mindful of, right?
Yeah. And of course, Dr. John's blunder-proof course on chessable is a good one to get because he was getting deep in the weeds with you on this. And this is right around when he was working on that course. And obviously, as a cognitive scientist himself, he's the perfect person to try to help us combat these tendencies. But as you allude to, perfection can never be the goal,
right?
Just marginal improvement. And so hearing you talk about all these studies, one other topic I wanted to hit from your writing was you mentioned somewhere that you felt like a lot of these scientific studies you felt like were focused more on elite players and not as many on casual players, which is a lot of what I end up talking about on the podcast. And I think that actually might be related. Like, you know, when I interview, especially in the early years, it took me a while to realize that a lot of very strong players end up becoming trainers, but the ones who don't, who are just professionals, I feel like don't necessarily have the best chess advice. And I think that filters through to the studies. So why do you think it is that it's only expert performance that, or not only, but predominantly expert performance that gets scientifically studied?
Because it's awesome. I mean, for real, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard not to be really impressed with the things that grandmasters can do.
Yeah.
I think for a long time, the field thought about chess as this really great sandbox for studying expertise.
Yeah.
Right? If expertise was something you wanted to know about, how do people acquire skills? Chess was this great domain where measurably there were people who did that. You know, and that measurably piece is important. The fact that there are ratings, there's a number that has psychometric properties that tells you about someone's playing strength. That's just super useful from the scientific perspective. And yeah, like when you think about some of the stuff grandmasters can accomplish, just how much stuff they have memorized. The blindfold simuls you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
The capacity to do something like that, it feels a bit otherworldly. And so as a scientist, you are kind of like, right, how do you pull that off? What's different about your cognition that means you can do that?
Yeah. But you nonetheless would like to see amateur players studied more as well?
Oh, yeah. And I think it's happening in part because there is a lot of data available about just ordinary players now. So that's, I think, supporting more work using that broader range of playing strength just because researchers have access to it. You can get the playing records of lots and lots of people who are, you know, humble patzers like me. And in a way, it's probably flipped a little bit. It's probably harder now to get that much data about a grandmaster, you know, because they're busy people. They don't necessarily, well, and they can be a little hesitant to share that much about their playing history or their training.
That's interesting. And one other study I wanted to be sure to highlight, this idea that pattern recognition might be overemphasized as a skill of elite players compared to the ability to problem solve.
Yeah.
In reviewing your writing, I actually found that surprising.
Oh, the overemphasis on recognition?
Yeah.
What surprised you about it?
Because, like, for example, when I wrote my book, you know, I wrote these 4 precepts of the 4 fundamental tenets of how to get better at chess. And Grandmaster Matthew Sadler, you know, former top 20 player in the world, mentioned that he felt like I should have mentioned pattern recognition more somewhere in the book. And you do notice that these grandmasters, like, they just assimilate so much so young that they recognize a lot of patterns. And that's something where I think it's particularly hard if you're an adult learner to catch up. So to me, it seems like this huge part of a grandmaster's toolbox.
Okay, I gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, and to me, I think it really is about that dual process that we think really strong players are capable of, that there is this entry point via pattern recognition, right? You can just quickly see the board, kind of understand what's happening on it, and get some ideas about how to proceed. But I think the thing that really distinguishes the strong player is not stopping there. Right. And that ability to calculate, to sort of hypothesis test and really work through which of these alternatives is really going to do it. Yeah, that maybe seems to be the very important and harder process to master.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it does square with something that's come up on the podcast over the years, which is just that not just that grandmasters calculate better, but they calculate more.
Yes.
I believe that was Dr. Jan Markos in Under the Surface who wrote that, but it's been echoed. I believe Anna Muzichuk said something similar as well. Or you might paraphrase or adjacent idea, the ability to see wider, not just deeper. They're definitely much more comprehensive in terms of scanning the board. And as I was thinking about it due to my own personal background, people sometimes as a former poker, like as a chess master turned poker pro, and there's a lot of us, you know, came back to chess, but people would ask what skills transfer. And I do think it's that ability to solve problems and to sit there and work through, as well as to take accountability for your decision making, that helped a lot. So what's next for your chess, Ben? Do you think you'll get to any tournaments this summer? Do you have any other research you want to get to?
I am research-wise. I'm talking with some friends who are also chess players, online chess players, about doing some work about mental imagery and chess calculation, because that's something I'm really interested in. Imagery is really challenging and fun from the scientific perspective, just because it's an internal state, right? You're trying to access this picture someone has in their mind that they have a strong feeling about, right? But as a scientist, you got to try and measure it. So that's something I'm really intrigued by and want to think about more in some projects I'm developing with some friends. In terms of my chess, I really want to get back to some over-the-board play. I would love that USCF rating to get a little higher. Like most people, I'm pretty sure I'm underrated. I'm pretty sure that number should be, at least, a couple tens higher, if not, if not hundreds, right? So I would like to get back to playing some over-the-board tournaments. When we moved to North Dakota, my wife and I used to joke that because it's kind of a small state, it was like, okay, like how hard is it to be the best Scrabble player in North Dakota, right? Like it's a smaller state, like maybe that's an easier thing. It's not, by the way. The strong players in North Dakota for chess anyway are quite strong, right? And it would be a tall order. But I would love to get to the state tournament one of these days, just to do it, right? Play in the open section and just hopefully have fun meeting some of the folks in this community that are among the best players.
Cool. Well, yeah, we would love to see that. And I would love it as, again, avid reader of your blog. If you ever do make it out, I would love like a tournament report.
For sure.
Even though you're primarily writing about the intersection of science and chess, for which we are extremely grateful. And possibly my last question, Ben, is the evergreen question for all chess player researchers. Like, if someone ceded you a grant to study anything you wanted chess related, what would you study?
Oh my goodness. If I actually got the blank check.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm a vision guy at heart. So I would be really interested in doing more of this work to understand what players see when they're looking at the board. And there's kind of two pieces that I'd be interested in. Some of my research that's not about chess has been about your peripheral vision and kind of understanding what you can get out of that stuff you see out at the edges of your visual field. I would love to see some work on just the specific mistakes players of different strength make about what's out there. What kinds of confusions do players have? Do pieces go missing? Do pieces tend to swap places? Is there some structure to the mistakes you tend to make because you can't see all that stuff out there? Another one, though, and this is maybe it feels a little sillier to me, but I think it kind of matters. I'm really interested in how just the different visual appearance of the game in different settings kind of matters. And I say this because you asked about what it was like to return to over-the-board play, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that is weird about it is seeing 3D pieces.
Yeah.
It sounds silly, but you play online and everything's in this nice, flat 2D arrangement. At least that's the way I have my stuff set up. And suddenly you're looking at this board in front of a real person that's got, 3D pieces standing up and they block each other. Right? Like there's kind of some jumble and some clutter, and these things that were obvious in that digital setting maybe just don't quite look enough alike in the real world 3D setting for you to process them as well. I think that'd be kind of a cool thing to look at. How much do changes in just the appearance of the game matter?
Yeah, and that gets back to your advice about using your eyes to scan the board, because people who are used to playing digitally, you don't have to do that as much because it's a more confined space.
Right. Right.
And you and Dr. John talked about, I think there was even a name for it, but this common thing of, did you guys call it a sniper or something? A long range,
bishop.
Like,
that was Dr.
bishop.
John's term. Yeah, the sniper bishop.
That was good. So this idea that like you're more likely to miss something from across the board. He showed an example of a Steinitz game where he blunders his queen and takes on G6, and there's a bishop sitting all the way on B1.
Yep.
So it's easy to miss something from all the way across the board, which gets back to your your advice. Anything else chess improvement related that you've just noticed in your own play that, like, you know, out of all the literature, out of all the advice people give, that you've noticed, like, you know, I don't know what the scientific studies say, but this is what works for me, sort of thing?
Well, works for me, I guess. You know, one thing I would say, so I read a book recently about blindfold chess, just the history of it.
Yeah, I've read that book.
Oh, it's really good.
So comprehensive. It's crazy.
Yeah. And there's a lot of just little tidbits in there that I found really fascinating. One that I was surprised by, and I spent some time doing it because I just was kind of stunned to see it in the book as such a direct piece of advice. A number of players that are successful at blindfold play suggested spending time just sort of memorizing the squares on the board.
Yeah.
Literally the empty board. Like just kind of getting used to holding the lower right quadrant in mind. So you really understood what color was each square, how to get those row and column indices linked up to colors of the board. And so I thought, you know, I've never done that. I've never actually just thought about the board as a spatial object. And so I did. Like I spent a little while just kind of trying to do some training to really hold that in mind and think about the board itself without pieces. And to be honest, I think it did give me a bit of a boost. I felt like my calculation was, at least subjectively, right? I got to be careful because I am a scientist. For me anyway, it did feel like it was coming easier to think about the board and not just the pieces.
Yeah, good to know. And that connects to another recurring theme on Perpetual Chess, that one guest will advise one thing and the other will say like the opposite. Because a few weeks ago, I interviewed a computer scientist, the founder of Nocti AI, and he was saying he's an adult chess learner, but when he came to chess, he tried all those board vision things and they weren't working. Okay. But he needed to improve his visualization skills. So he actually ended up memorizing games and learning to play through them in his head like before he went to bed as a method that worked for him. Mm-hmm. So the moral of the story, as always, is just see what works for you. Like try the click on a square exercises. And I've recommended step 2, thinking ahead, many times. But if it isn't working for you, try to be objective and try something else. The other quick point I wanted to highlight is that Jerry Wells and I many years ago did a podcast about the book Blindfold Chess. So it's like a 400-page book. So if anyone listening doesn't have time for the whole book but wants to get a few highlights, I'll link to that as well. But Ben, this has been great. Really honored to have finally gotten to chat with you. And
thank you so much for having me on. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, and I look forward to so people can follow you on LiChess, right? Or subscribe to your Substack?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, and they'll get the same posts either way and maybe a few extras on Substack, right?
Yeah, there's some extra stuff on Substack about vision science, some art stuff. I mean, just random things I find interesting.
Okay, and while you're at it, listeners, I know a few of you still are not subscribed to my free newsletter, so subscribe to mine as well while you're at it. And But yeah, that should be it. Thank you, Ben. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much.